Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
So, we're often told that capitalism started with taking land. But what if that's only half the story? What if it also needed to take control of the human body itself? Well, that's the provocative idea at the heart of Silvia Federici's landmark book, Caliban and the Witch. She makes this powerful argument that the long history of violence against women, well, it wasn't some unfortunate byproduct of the times. It was actually a necessary precondition for capitalism to even get off the ground.
So what Federici is really doing here is telling us that the standard story we all learned about how capitalism got started, it's missing something huge.
Okay, so you've probably heard of this idea of primitive accumulation, right? It's the classic story. Common lands were fenced off, peasants got kicked out, and they had no choice but to become the first wage workers. That's the standard view. But Federici comes in and says, hold on a second. She adds this absolutely crucial other half to the story. She says, yeah, all that happened, but at the same time, this new system also required a war on women and a total takeover of their bodies and their reproductive lives. And those infamous witch hunts, they weren't some weird side story. Nope, they were right at the center of it all.
And this really gets us to the core of her argument. For capitalism to work, it couldn't just reorganize the fields and factories. It had to go deeper. It had to completely reshape the family, our social lives, and, most importantly, the female body itself.
A huge part of this was about devaluing what we now call reproductive labor. Think about all the work that goes into creating and sustaining human life. Childbirth, raising kids, cooking, cleaning, caring for the sick. All of that was systematically separated from what was considered real work, the productive work that earned a wage. Instead, it was reframed as just a woman's natural job, something you just do, unpaid. It became this massive, invisible subsidy, propping up the entire capitalist system. And this is where Federici drops this incredibly powerful line. The body has been for women in capitalist society what the factory has been for male-waged workers. Just think about that for a second. The female body itself became the new frontier for exploitation. Basically, it was treated like a machine whose primary job was to produce the most essential commodity of all, more workers. Now, check out the timing on this, because this is where it gets really mind-blowing. The witch hunts, they weren't some leftover from the Dark Ages. Not at all. They actually peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries. And what else was happening right then? The enclosure of lands in Europe and the massive expansion of colonization and the slave trade. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a violent three-pronged attack happening all at once.
So how did they pull this off? Well, this new social order didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had to be brutally enforced. And Federici points to a few key patterns of power that were used to build it.
First up, the violence wasn't just chaotic or random. It was actually a calculated economic policy. The witch hunts were, for all intents and purposes, a state-sponsored campaign of terror. The goal? To crush resistance from the peasantry, to dismantle the social power that women held, especially as healers and community figures, and ultimately to take away their control over their own bodies. But you can't just use brute force, right? You need a good story to justify it. So new moral narratives became a powerful tool of enforcement. Think about it. Things women have been doing for centuries, healing, midwifery, even using contraception, were suddenly relabeled as evil, as witchcraft. It was the perfect moral cover to attack their independence. All of this created a situation where women's work became systematically invisible. Here's a wild way to think about it. As the actual common lands were being fenced off, women's bodies and their unpaid labor became the new commons. They became this kind of natural resource that men could just use, a substitute for the communal land that everyone had lost. And finally, what held this whole new, terrifying structure together? Fear. Pure and simple. The terror of the witch hunts was incredibly effective at shattering community bonds. It drove a wedge between men and women and taught an entire society to be suspicious of and to police any woman who stepped out of line. Now, underneath this whole violent transformation was a really profound shift in how people even thought about the human body. And this famous quote here from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes just captures the new mindset perfectly. He's literally describing the body as a collection of springs, strings, and wheels. This was the birth of a new idea,
The body isn't some magical vessel connected to the cosmos. No, it's a machine.
And this new philosophy drove a three-step transformation. First, you had the pre-capitalist idea of the magical body, a body that was full of its own powers and deeply connected to nature. Then that body was attacked. It was disciplined by the church and state to stamp out all those irrational forces. And once that was done, it could be rebuilt, reconceived as the mechanical body. Essentially, it became capitalism's very first work machine, a factory designed for one single purpose: to produce more labor.
So why does any of this matter? Well, uncovering this hidden history isn't just an interesting history lesson. It really changes how we see everything around us today.
It forces us to ask a really important question. If this is the real origin story of capitalism, what does that tell us about the system we're all living in right now?
What we start to see is that capitalism was never just an economic system about markets and money. It's always been a system of social relationships. And from day one, it was built on the division, the degradation, and the control of certain bodies over others. It means that things like sexism and racism, they aren't just unfortunate bugs in the system. They're foundational features. They were coded in from the very beginning.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive links in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.